You're listening to the Full and Thriving Podcast, a place where courageous women come to break free from food obsession, heal their relationship with their body, and strive to live a life that's present, lighthearted, and meaningful. If you're listening, my wish is that this podcast serves as a catalyst that inspires you to nourish your body, nurture your mind, and energize your spirit. I'm your host, Meg McCabe, a certified life coach and eating disorder recovery coach with a PhD in having a good time. Just kidding about that last part. Anyway, thank you so much for listening and enjoy the show. In this week's episode, we have two very special guests, Vanessa Scaringi and Kathryn Garland, the co-founders of Calm Counseling in Austin, Texas. Vanessa is a licensed psychologist and certified eating disorder specialist supervisor. Kathryn is a licensed clinical social worker. Together, they take the HAES-informed approach when treating people with eating disorder and body image issues. In this episode, the three of us discuss attachment theory, including what it is, the different types of attachment wounds, and how all of it relates to folks with eating disorders. Attachment is a super fascinating topic in the world of psychology, and I know that looking at eating disorders through this lens throughout this episode will be so eye-opening for all of you. So I hope you enjoy it, and here's the next episode of the show. Hello. Hi, Kate. Hi, Vanessa. How are you two today?
Good. How are you?
It's so great to have you both on the show. This is the first time I'm recording an episode with two guests. I'm so excited to have you both here. The topic is one that fascinates me, the idea of attachment and eating disorders and how they are related. But before we dive into that, I'd love to know a little bit about both of you. So if you could please take a moment to just explain your background and maybe how you became interested in attachment wounds and eating disorders.
Sure. Yeah. I'm Vanessa. So when there's multiple voices, I'm the Vanessa voice. The more the merrier. So I got interested, I think over time, started to really see the healing that goes on in longer term therapy and really moving away from like an eating disorder, internalized, nasty inner critic eating disorder voice. So I saw that connection over more of the long-term work that I was doing with clients. And it made me sort of do a little bit of an overview of like, what is the attachment style that my clients are presenting with? And how does that relate to their eating disorder and the start of their eating disorder and how it's kind of continued? And then I think just Kate and I often have long conversations about the state of the world and understanding sort of that we're in a moment of insecure attachment in general. And just sort of at large, the world at large being sort of, inundated with really negative social media, the government issues that we're all sort of facing and dealing with, especially in Texas. So I think just in my individual work with clients, saw that there was like, oh yeah, there's something here going on individually with attachment styles and the origins of an eating disorder and then long-term healing that happens with relational therapy and then what's going on in the world and how all those things relate. So that was just a whole lot of words. I hope they made sense.
Wow, thank you. It's already bringing up such an interesting concept of just like we have attachment on so many different levels. There's like personal attachment on a micro level, one-to-one, and like maybe family level. And then there's within the world and what's going on. So I'm very curious about that. Vanessa, thank you for introducing yourself and sharing a little bit about that. Kate, what about you?
So that's such a good question. I'm a social worker, and I think after graduating with my MSW, I went into a postgraduate training for psychoanalytic therapy. And there was a lot of focus on root origin, kind of causes of symptoms and difficulties that people were experiencing in their lives. And that really got me interested in attachment theory and always was sort of practicing with that lens. And then getting a job in an eating disorder treatment center, I found myself, kind of much to the chagrin of other therapists that were working in the eating disorder clinic, I didn't know a whole lot about kind of skills-based therapy. So I was using attachment therapy in those kind of shorter term interactions with clients and sometimes longer term, depending on how long folks stayed at the treatment center, but was just using that because that's what I knew. And it seemed so applicable. And I would often get frustrated that I wanted to work with people longer term that would get discharged for reasons that maybe were beyond what they actually needed. So that really kind of like has always been a part of how I've viewed and worked with people who were struggling with disordered eating and eating disorders.
So for you, you saw the connection very clearly from the very beginning.
I think so. I think it felt very applicable. As Vanessa and I started working together and started a practice and kind of, digging into some research and doing some presentations on the topic, it was very clear that in terms of research, insecure attachment is very linked to eating disorders. That's something that often they find a linkage to.
Wow, so fascinating. Before we go any further, I'd love it if one of you could explain what exactly attachment theory is.
Okay, so, the sort of not super heady version, which is always my preference anyway, is that attachment is when you think about how children learn to keep proximity to their early caregivers. That can be demonstrated through maybe you have a caregiver that was really overwhelmed and needing a lot of space. And as a young child, you sort of learned, okay, it's in my interest to give my parent more space and lend room. And that can sort of develop into an avoidant attachment style. Maybe I'll back up a little bit more. Secure attachment, which is like what we're all hoping for in our own lives and in raising our children and being in the world. We call it the gold standard, right? It's what everybody's aiming for. And it basically just breaks down to, you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be a perfect caregiver, kind of a good enough caregiver that made you feel like they were consistently there for you. When they did make mistakes, they were able to repair with you. They were able to come to you and say, let's get connected again. And just being a loving and warm source of comfort and a sense of security in your world. Insecure, there are several different categories of that. And that's kind of what I was referring to in terms of avoidant attachment. That might look like somebody who needs a lot of space, as I said, has a harder time kind of talking about feelings and getting really vulnerable. They're kind of wary of, scared of getting too connected to people and reliant on people. And then the other one, which like lots of people can identify with, and many people can identify with all of them, but is an anxious attachment, right? That's where it's just, you could not get enough reassurance that you are safe and you're really having a lot of attempts to try to reconnect, maybe even difficulty with your own self-soothing, that you're looking to other people or you're looking to other relationships to really garner that. And then when you think about a disorganized attachment, sometimes Vanessa will refer to this as kind of a mixture of avoidant and anxious, that there is a kind of a doing and undoing. Like, I want to be connected to this person. I want to take them in, and I'm anxiously awaiting getting close to them. And then when I do, I just have to get out. It feels too scary. It feels too overwhelming. I need to kind of move away. And that's my best attempt at kind of breaking them down.
Thank you for that. Vanessa, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think Kate, that sums it up really well. I think as far as with eating disorders, I think most folks would assume correctly that insecure attachment styles often lend themselves to needing to cope. And eating disorders are sort of a way of trying to manage the feelings that come up when there's not security in attachment styles. So, just to expand on what Kate was saying in terms of eating disorders, we're probably seeing, and let's face it, like secure attachment through and through is really challenging. Like we all have moments of insecure attachments, whether or not we have an insecure attachment style, but with different people, they might bring up different feelings of insecure attachments. But someone with an eating disorder likely had some sense of insecure attachments growing up and used an eating disorder as a way of trying to manage that.
Okay. So if I get this right, just so everyone listening has a good baseline, attachment style is basically something that's developed from infancy, childhood, And if you receive like the love in an environment where you feel really seen, heard, and secure, you develop a secure attachment style more or less. And then if you have an attachment wound, that's when you start to skew off into insecure attachment, disorganized attachment, or avoidant attachment. Okay,
That's
I see
great.
head nods. It looks like
Yeah,
we're right
you
on.
got it.
You got
Mhm.
it. High fives.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. And one more piece of that is it's sort of a way of moving through the world, attachment style. You know, it's transferable to it's not just necessarily relationships per se, but like an anxious style might be anxious in general. You know, there's sort of a way in which you're relating to the world also in this like insecure way or very secure way.
Interesting. I do love that lens because with the amount of I know about attachment style, which is maybe a mild amount, I can see how it translates into how I relate to the world, not just people, even how I relate to like coworkers or the news or, you know, myself and my
Responsibilities.
self-talk.
Mhm.
Responsibilities. Yes, so true.
Mhm.
So if we're thinking about folks with eating disorders, it sounds like the majority, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, have some sort of anxious style attachment. That seems to be what research is indicating.
I would say insecure. Yeah. So insecure is sort of the umbrella, and then anxious is just one of of the insecure types. And then there's disorganized, and then there's avoidant. So those are the insecure types.
Okay, that's good. I actually was in my head confusing insecure and anxious. So that's good. So insecure is more the umbrella.
Mhm.
So what's an example? Like how might someone who has like an anxious attachment style, what's an example of what their childhood might have looked like? I know this could be millions of examples.
You know, all of this sort of research started in these experiments where researchers would throw a child's caregiver in a room with a stranger and see how the child would respond. And so someone with an anxious attachment, that was what you asked, right? The anxious one?
Yep. Yeah.
They would really like see the stranger and cling to the caregiver, like, you better not leave this room. And so they might move through the world with that same sense and urge to really cling to someone or a caregiver. And it can be really unsettling. And as you move through friendships and other relationships, when people aren't reassuring you, like Kate said, constantly, or they're not able to stay there while you're worried all the time, it's a very untethering experience. And it leaves people feeling, I mean, just to define the term with the word anxious.
Absolutely. And so what creates that sort of response in a child? Like what makes them feel like they need to be clinging to the parent?
I think that's what's so fascinating about it is that it isn't something that's easily defined because you could have a child who is clinging to a caregiver for fear of abandonment because maybe they've lost someone or maybe there's, been some sort of disruption in their security. You could also have a child that is shut down a little bit emotionally and a little bit more avoidant because they had a similar loss, because they had an abandonment. So I don't know that there's one way in which it always plays out. It's very complex. We are strange, messy, complicated beings. Vanessa and I sometimes, when we're talking about this topic, will sort of say, it's really not astrology or based or kind of you can say this is exactly how this is and this is how this person will react. It's an amalgamation of things, which is what's so important about looking at the societal piece, that how you could really have a pretty secure attachment in your family of origin where you do feel a lot of resiliency and ability to cope in stressful situations and be pretty affected by all of the disruptive situations that are kind of happening in our world right now, or the fear of some of the things that the future holds. So, part of our premise is you do your best within the family of origin or to repair some of those early wounds that may have occurred with the help of a good therapist so that you can combat a pretty unpredictable and in many ways likely continuing to be an insecurely based existence here.
Okay, so what you're saying is even if you like survive the household environment, there's still the external world you have to
Contend
find some
with.
peace in. Yeah.
Not to be too dystopian, I think, our premise is also that can really help to kind of manage the difficult parts of the world right now, to work on creating more stability in your internal sense of self and your relationships with people.
Okay. So with eating disorders, how do you see these attachment styles really playing out?
Yeah, so I think, we like to start with saying that it's not prescriptive. Just because someone has a tendency to be a little bit more anxiously attached or avoidantly attached or disorganized, that doesn't mean that they have a certain kind of eating disorder. But I think it's pretty useful just as a frame of reference that, when someone tends to be avoidant in their attachment styles, they avoid relationships or connection or intimacy. And they might also avoid food, or they might try to numb, out with food. And so there's a desire to avoid feelings. And the use of food is a way to get that desire to avoid that need met. And so these are just, coping strategies that are not useful, but yeah, so that's one way to think of it. But I was thinking about anxious as well. So like the idea of, binging and purging is something that comes up quite a bit. So if you're an anxiously attached individual, you might feel really like a strong desire for attachment, but not being able to get that need met. I think about like really wanting and like needing like a golden retriever, and just like kind of your soul is out there in the world, but like you're not able to really get that need met. And so you might turn to really another kind of numbing through binging and purging or over exercising. And disorganized might just be a mix of all of it. When you think about someone who's attached in a disorganized fashion, they desire and crave, and they also avoid. So that might be like chewing and spitting, but all of these things, again, not really prescriptive. It's just kind of useful as a frame of reference.
So fascinating just to hear how these attachments can translate into relationships with food and body.
Yeah.
Kate, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'm thinking about, another element to get into the weeds more of a secure attachment is really talking about, I think you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, that there's sort of an inherent value piece, that if you create a sense in your child that no matter, mistakes that are made or struggles that they go through or how they look or how the world is reacting to them, if you are imparting within them, you are just so valuable for being you, right? Like there's nothing that you need to produce or perform in order to be an important person to me. That is something that is so hard to come by societally in this moment. And, especially in the conversation about teens and social media and the messaging, this barrage of images of perfection and Photoshop and, living in this kind of hyper reality that's outside of the day-to-day kind of messiness of being human and very performative, that part of getting securely attached is getting back to those roots of who am I outside of how I am seen in the world? Like, who am I outside of what I give to people or produce in my job or the clothes that I wear or how my house looks or, all these things that are really prioritized in our modern world and in a consumerist culture, that getting to a secure attachment base is really trying to find ways to get connected to living outside of producing or performing, which we would argue is kind of just existing in the world. And that's really hard to do. Like, it's really hard to slow down, especially with the advances of technology and how efficiency is so prioritized in our lives and kind of cramming in everything that we can in the day-to-day, which I know Vanessa and I would be the first to blame ourselves that
totally
we get caught
guilty.
up in that rat race. And it's part of the disconnection, right? It's part of the numbing out and slowing down. That's a piece of a secure attachment, feeling like you can get connected to that.
So I feel like you're touching on how the external world can shake up our like sense of security with, and you mentioned social media. I know, Vanessa, I think you mentioned like global events in the beginning. Could you expand a little bit about how the world around us is impacting our sense of security?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think about how unpredictable things are. We've been talking a lot, reflecting back on the pandemic, and I think all of these issues were happening before the pandemic as well. I think the pandemic just sort of highlighted where we are as a culture, but there's so many expectations of us, to produce and to achieve and to, I'm putting success in quotes because I think that's sort of defined for us often. And so much of that feels precarious. If you don't make a certain amount of money, then are you successful? If you don't look a certain way, are you successful? And I mean, obviously, I believe so. But if you're measuring your success based on what other people think of you all the time, you could always feel like you're missing out. And we do live in a world where I think there's a quick fix, in quotes, so to speak, that people can immediately feel like, okay, I'm part of something and I can feel better if I just achieve X or look a certain way or get this feedback or validation in X regard. And so just kind of piecing these pieces together with attachment, when you weren't told by your caregiver that you could just be, and that's just totally fine. And, those messages weren't really delivered and felt when you were young. Like, it's really easy to fall into this trap that we all sort of face on a day-to-day basis. I know I'm not answering your question necessarily about the precarious state of our world, but it's related. And I think people avoid like how things feel. I know I do in our, day-to-day, if whatever we're in a session right now in Texas. And so we're getting all this news about what's passing, what's not. And so if you're, worried about the future or what kind of laws will pass or won't pass, it's really easy to turn to things like that we can have sort of control over. So if I look a certain way, or if I, make an X amount of money, maybe I'll feel better about how just tenuous things are.
I was just going to add to that. I think that's absolutely right. Who wouldn't need ways to cope in this modern world, right? So then when you look at the proliferation of eating disorders, or just like you were saying, Vanessa, this kind of problematic issues that already occurred. People were already experiencing disordered eating. People were also already living within this sort of diet culture realm. But this loneliness piece that kind of came more into focus through the pandemic and like in years after. And what is loneliness? Like, it's not that we can't be connected to each other. We can be connected to each other 24 hours a day, right? We can have access to one another. It really is about being known. It really is about being understood, feeling like it isn't just, I can reach out and touch this person through my phone or through an app or whatever. It's feeling like you are a unique individual to that other set of human beings. And we're at a loss of that.
Wow, that's so hard. So how do you see all of this playing into your practice when it comes to folks in recovery from eating disorders?
Yeah, I'm going back to how I sort of started to piece together attachment in the eating disorder work that I'm doing and that I do. I think about, or I kind of had the experience of looking at the work that I've already done with clients long-term as healing their attachment issues. So developing relationships with folks that had a reparative experience. And I'm not like saying I healed their attachment wounds, but, just over time that they knew they could make mistakes with me, or they could tell me they're mad at me and I wasn't going anywhere, or, engaging in this really relational therapy experience where every week, it's predictable. I'm still here. I'm not going anywhere. And that really being a healing experience. And I think that actually can, over time, reduce the noise and reduce the chaos that we can feel in the world, like just kind of knowing. And I also do group therapy. And so knowing that, my clients have me as an individual, but also their peers in a group can be a really stabilizing force and can help them internalize a kinder self-talk, some more compassion, and not just feel like they need to perform or achieve something.
I love that. Yeah. I feel like you're modeling that secure attachment for them of just like accepting them as they are and being there and, you know, no matter what, like no matter what's said in the session, always being there for that person. That's really good, probably transformative in itself. I know I've been to therapy and it definitely feels that way. Yeah, that's very interesting.
Can I add something in?
Go ahead.
Okay. I think that in many ways, what Vanessa's talking about, this sort of relational therapy where the therapist is really using their self, right? They're getting in there, they're getting messy, they're sharing an experience with their clients. That's an antidote to being a producer or a performer or whatever. That if you feel like you can, for a lot of people, that's huge to be able to tell your therapist, like, I'm mad at you. I feel like you weren't paying attention enough last week when I told you that I was upset about this thing with my friend and you kind of let me down. To be able to have your therapist respond to that with compassion, understanding, and validation. Yeah, I think that's fair. Like I felt that a little bit when we were meeting. I was kind of distracted. I can see how that came through and that was hard for you and like not what you needed. You needed really for me to be in it with you that day and even more than usual. That's it. That's what that enriches the attachment, right? Like that's when we avoid or try to control for those feelings coming out in the therapy room, we're really doing our clients a disservice because that kind of messiness of relationships is how we stay close to people. It's how we keep those connections going. Nobody's a mind reader, right? We're going to have misattunements. We're going to have difficulties come up. And instead of, when a client can tell you, instead of turning to my eating disorder when I was mad at you, I told myself, I'm going to come in next week and I'm going to tell you that you let me down. Yeah. Who can ask for more? Like that as a therapist, like that's it. That's what we're aiming for is to release some of those old ways of managing our emotional state through the eating disorder and really bring it back into the relationship so that you can have that full enriched experience.
That's really fascinating. I feel like people can get sucked into certain patterns, right? Like when you have an eating disorder, the pattern of using a behavior, being triggered with an emotion, turning towards a behavior and letting that cycle of like maybe like emotion, behavior, and then relief kind of continue on. And what you're saying is through therapy, you can start to transform. Maybe that's like an example of an anxious attachment, right? If you're like in that cycle, it could be an avoidant attachment too.
Absolutely.
The act of going to therapy and being able to not react with the eating disorder is a very healing, like transformative experience.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I mean, and there's so much in that, just being able to take up space. Like Kate was saying, the example of telling someone you're angry, creating space for your feelings, being expansive with that and taking up space with your therapist and naming what's going on. You're not stuffing the feelings down. You're saying what's on your mind and you're, not using a behavior to navigate those feelings. It's huge.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see it as that healing process through the lens of attachment. And when you are both sharing, I'm also thinking about that concept of the eating disorder self and, the healthy voice and the eating disorder voice. I'm sure there's attachment within that. So can you expand how like someone's attachment might be manifested or how it looks through the eating disorder voice, like what that can look like, how you can begin to heal that? Because I'm sure there's so much of attachment being kind of projected into that relationship with your eating disorder.
I think that's right, that it can sometimes be in the way that we were talking about your lens of the world or your attachment style. If it is more avoidant, that could transcend to this sort of proxy kind of other that is the eating disorder, right? And so that I was just having this fantasy as you were talking about that of a client coming in and their internal experience of feeling emotional and telling themselves, don't get emotional, don't cry. Like you feel yourself wanting to do it. And there's either a voice, maybe that's your eating disorder voice, or maybe it's some kind of internalized, avoidant attachment style that says, don't you dare let this therapist see you vulnerable, or, like, don't let that touch you. And maybe going home and the eating disorder saying, okay, well, we're not going to eat tonight. Like, we're going to avoid food because we needed to avoid all day. And that feels too dangerous to kind of nourish ourselves in that way. That you can kind of have this sort of projected other sort of proxy state that can have a similar sort of attachment or avoidant attachment style. I think that that's very true. And that, all the more reason, if you are in that session feeling the emotion and it comes out, and oftentimes I'll hear people in that kind of a state of mind be like, I hate this. I hate that this is happening. Like, I don't want to let out this emotion. Everything within me is screaming, don't do this, don't show you this. And how difficult it is to differentiate, separate yourself from that type of attachment style, right? To really lean into, I'm going to try to trust that this therapist is going to be able to see me fully and is trustworthy for me to be in this vulnerable state. That's a very difficult thing to do when you are so embedded with this eating disorder voice or, insecure attachment style. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does make sense in the sense that, there's something internally, you're struggling with. It's like a relationship or an attachment that needs healing in itself.
And the eating disorder is such a safer experience, for folks. Like, they know what to expect when they, like Kate's example, when they go home and avoid food and restrict, they know what to expect in the sense of, I'm not going to feel this any deeper. I'm going to cut it off. I'm going to stay in my tunnel vision of whatever it is, not feeling and numbing out, versus I don't know what to expect if I open up to someone and I allow them to see what my process is like and show them that I can get, really sad about whatever it is. Like, it's just so much more predictable for folks when they have an eating disorder to engage in behaviors. And so we're asking folks to do something entirely different. It takes a long time to work towards developing new skills and developing comfort in telling people what's really going on versus, I'm going to just use a behavior. Like, that's just so much more predictable. And I know that road versus I don't know this one.
It makes me think of that Anita Johnson, the log analogy, right? That, like, your friends and family are standing on the side of the river and saying, it's safe to come over, you can let go. Much like an eating disorder, in her analogy, she's kind of giving credence to that kept you safe at a certain point, right? Like, you felt you needed that and you had few resources to do without it. Same for an attachment style, right? That maybe you learned that you had to kind of cling tightly to caregiver to get your needs met. Or if you were the anxious child who was like hanging on to the leg, you were hanging on for dear life, literally, because you needed that caregiver to help you survive. So it is like kind of an exploration of kind of validating this was set up in a way to keep you safe, and it no longer kind of serves the same purpose and you don't need it anymore. So I think there's a lot of connection, so many different connecting points of attachment and disordered eating as a maladaptive coping skill.
So true. Yeah. It's always helpful to bring in that lens of how did this serve you? How did that keep you safe, in your lifetime, and recognizing, okay, like the log, it's no longer going to be beneficial to keep this in my life. And now it's time to start transforming that attachment wound into one that's more secure. What would you say, like, if there are people listening to this episode who are like, oh my gosh, like, I clearly have attachment wounds going on, and I have attachment issues with food, and I have attachment issues like in almost all areas of my life. How can someone, say, with an eating disorder, start to approach healing their attachment wounds?
I think just first and foremost is to meet those realizations with compassion and not judging, just that same idea of like the Anita Johnson example of not judging it as like a bad thing. This just served you at a time in your life. And so if you can meet those experiences with that kind of approach, I think that you go a lot further and that kindness really does go a lot further. But from that point, I think it's really useful to develop awareness of when your attachment style is interfering in your relationships. When are you using behaviors to cope with that? And so kind of, we pull from all different modalities. So behavior change, we're big into, distress tolerance, all the things. But I think just slowing down and really being curious about, so when do I engage in behaviors? I just had a date and I go home and I restrict. Okay, well, that's something to keep looking at. Like maybe I have more of an avoidance style. Maybe I don't want to connect with people. And all of this, obviously, we can talk about as being easier maybe with a therapist. And so, being in therapy and talking to your therapist about these things, like, oh, I'm starting to piece these puzzle pieces together, that I use behaviors as a way to really help me tolerate the dysfunctional attachment style that I might have. And again, going slow with the process and being really observational as a way of trying to impart change. And I do think that this work does require us to be experiential as well. And so eventually that work will build on itself. And my hope for folks listening is that they allow themselves to get messy in their relationships a little bit more, that they might challenge themselves to say something they wouldn't say to a friend or therapist about how they're feeling. That's that anecdote that Kate was describing. Like if you can do it a little bit differently and it ends up being okay, like you slowly heal those attachment wounds.
I love those very tangible examples, like slowing down, observing, noticing what your patterns are, and then not being afraid to step out and get a little messy and do the things that your inner voice is telling you not to do or telling you shouldn't say or express. I feel like the root of so many eating disorders is lack of self-expression, right? Or not having a voice, not being able to express your voice. And that could be from anxious attachment or avoidant attachment, I assume.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
Kate, was there anything you wanted to add for folks listening who might be embarking on this healing journey?
I love everything Vanessa said. I think that the only other thing I would say is if you are struggling in that capacity, you're in good company. There's a lot of folks out there who are getting really the opposite message of that kind of true self, authentic self, inherent value, and getting inundated with messages that are telling them to think more superficially or to be kind of more in this kind of hyper reality of social media and all of that. And like, obviously, social media is not something that we can remove from our lives. But one of the great things is there are different voices on this platform, right? Like, there are ways in which you can turn down the volume on the one messaging and turn up the volume on other messaging so that you can do exactly what you just described, Meg. Find your voice, find yourself within all of that noise and start to live more connected to the people around you and to yourself. So, yeah, that's the hope.
Well, thank you both so much for joining me on the show today. This was very eye-opening. I love hearing that connection between attachment and eating disorders. I think being able to look at things through a new framework is always so helpful, or a new lens. And that's exactly what you both were able to help us with today. So thank you so much. For those listening, how can they find the two of you? How can they reach out if they need support?
Okay, this is where we're going to show we don't know a lot about social media, but I think our Instagram is Calm Counseling PLLC. That's the handle?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. And our website is Keep Calm ATX. So www.keepcalmatx as in Austin.com.
Okay. And do you see virtual clients as well, or is it all Texas-based?
We see, Texas and then everywhere else within wherever we're licensed.
Fabulous. Well, that is great to know. Thank you both for joining me on the show today.
Thank you.
This is super helpful.
Thanks, Meg.
Thanks for having us.
All right, that concludes this week's episode of the Full and Thriving podcast. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this episode of the show. When you have a moment, please head on over to Instagram and follow my recovery coaching account at Meg_McCabe to stay up to date on everything I'm doing in recovery land. And if you're feeling extra inspired, please send me a direct message to let me know how this podcast has impacted your life. I'd love to hear your feedback. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week.